Teachers, you are going to get the summer that you actually want and deserve and need this year. You're going to get the rest and the relaxation that you need because you know that next year is going to be your best school year ever. You're not going to spend all summer like doom scrolling Pinterest or researching which classroom management system you need to invest in or what overhauls you're going to make. And you're not going to beat yourself up over what went wrong last year, what you're going to do better next year, because we are going to set your classroom up for success, starting with the ground up in a very like peaceful, structured way. We know that classroom management starts with a really good, solid, structured foundation. We're going to do it all together, starting with like your actual physical space, because I know it can be so overwhelming. Also, just gives us like a really solid basis for a great classroom. I'm your teacher big sister. I have been there. I've done that. I love classroom management. I love organization. I love structure. I love systems. And we are going to set you up for success next year in a very peaceful, vibesy way, starting with our physical space. So let's get into it. So if we want really solid classroom management, we're going to start with our routines because that's where we know like good classroom management comes from. We're going to start with like our physical space because that's going to give us like a foundation for like how our room flows. So you walk into your classroom in August, it's a blank slate. You have no idea where to start, or maybe you left yourself with a disaster in May because you were just like over it. We've all done it. We all do it. I know it's so overwhelming. Just keep in mind that we want to like design for efficiency. We want to choose function over form. So we want to like design a place that's going to be like efficient and work for us and work with us and for our kids, and then focus on like how to make it feel like home. So like the bones of your classroom are going to be like, where are you versus where are your kids? And that's really going to depend on like, are you a kindergarten teacher that does like centers and you teach all the content areas, or are you like a sixth grade science teacher? So obviously those classroom setups are going to be very, very different. You know, little pockets of instructional areas versus like, you know, your desk set up in rows and columns. You're going to draw like a map or like a blueprint of your classroom. You need to think about what areas are for you and what areas are for your students. So like prioritizing and like things we want to avoid, you always want to avoid like traffic areas that like cause like congestion or bottlenecking. So before you think about that, you have to think about like what are the areas that your students are going to be using. Like, do you have cubbies or do you have lockers? Do you have table groups or are you going to have the rows? Is there a place where your students line up or come into the classroom? Those are the places that you need to make sure have plenty of space, because where you have students congregating is where you're going to have behavioral issues. You also want to avoid like any like gray area, like students being like, oh, can we be over here or can we not? Clear defined areas that are for you versus clear defined areas that are for your students. And we also want to avoid like any inconsistency where like things are kept, how to use those things, when and where students can be in those places. Like they need to stay the same every single day. Backpacks always go on the exact same hook. Things are labeled with students' names or numbers. They use the same cubby every day. They sit in the same seat every day, because the more consistency you have, the less clutter you're going to have up here for your students, the less behavior issues you're going to have. And like I said, so if we're going to start with like our desk arrangements or our seating charts, that's really going to depend on like what your content area is. In fourth grade and fifth grade, I've always done table groups. I've tried so many different things. I've taught all the content areas, and no matter what content I teach, I always go back to table groups. For me, nothing's better because they can work independently. They can work in partners. They can work in groups. I love group work. We work in our table groups every day. I've tried the desk pairs. I've tried single desks. I've tried the long rows. I've tried banquet tables. I've tried U-shapes. I've tried so many things. I always go back to, in one way or another, table groups. So do with that information what you will. And then also, if you're in elementary school, you're obviously going to want to have a place in your classroom where your students can line up. Like transitioning in and out of your classroom is a notorious time of day when behavior issues arise. That's where things can like unravel really quickly. Having like a good grasp on your lining up time, your transition time, is going to be key. So I've had years where I have not had a place in my classroom where my students can line up just because of the sheer number of desks in my classroom. But obviously it's ideal to have a place in your classroom where your students can line up and your students can come into the classroom when you guys are transitioning. Another key structure in your classroom is also going to be like where your students keep their things, whether it's cubbies, lockers, book boxes, a shelf, tubs, bins, inside their desks, whatever it is. You need to consider on like what things are going to be going home with your students, what things are going to be leaving your classroom with your students, what things are going to stay and live in your classroom. I'm team my stuff stays in my classroom, because we all know, or you'll learn over time, honestly, that when stuff leaves your classroom, you obviously have way more chances of that stuff not returning to your classroom. That's where the folders get lost. That's where the folders get ripped. The notebooks go home and never come back. So the way that I've always done it is we've been very lucky that we've always had cubbies with backpack hooks underneath. And I've had this self-contained. I've had this with 3 different classes that rotate, and we've always found a way to make it work. But in each cubby, we would have book boxes, and that's where our students would keep like their subject area notebooks that would not leave my classroom. So, you know, my math folders, my math notebooks, my science folders, science notebooks, social studies notebooks, those would live in their book box. And then what they would take with them from class to class or what they would take with them home would be like their planner, their homework folder, their pencil bag, their device, their library books. Those are the things that would go with them from class to class. Before you can kind of like plan out like how it's going to look in your classroom, you need to think about like how you want that to work. You might need to get together with your team and kind of decide like as a group, what materials are you guys going to do, backpacks that go from class to class, like how's that going to look for you. Whatever you do wind up doing, it's going to be key that your students use the same space every single day. It's got to be labeled with either your classes, or labeled with those students' names, but students need to know this is where my stuff goes. And we're going to talk later about making that like part of your like your transition routines, like where students keep their things. But it needs to be part of like your daily routines, that their students put their stuff away or collect their things from that place or put their things away in the morning. Like that's going to be like an integral foundational part of your classroom routine. And then let's talk about like what your space is going to look like. So how you design like your teacher space is also going to depend on, again, like what your content area and your grade level is. Obviously a kindergarten teacher is going to have a very different desk space than like a 8th grade math teacher. And then new teachers, you may not know this, you may have like a perfect idea in your head of like what your teacher desk and space and orientation, like where your projector and your computer and everything is facing your students. And then you walk into your classroom and you realize that's not going to work because the cable connection is on the other wall. So trust, they'll even change it sometimes from year to year, but just know that like you may have to pivot your plans depending on like stuff that you can't control, like where your projector is. God forbid they put your projector on the opposite side of the like the Ethernet cable, to where you have your projector over here and your teacher desk has to be like on the other side of the classroom. I can't imagine anything worse, but it happens. It's happened to all of us. So ideally you would have like, your teacher desk would be close to like your instructional area, like where you stand and teach. And that's also going to be close to like, if you have to do small groups, a space over there. So ideally you would want to keep like all those things together, like adjacent, so that where it's kind of like you can just like flow and move about as you need to. And then your student space would be, a separate area. Some things to think about whenever you're setting up like your teacher space also is like what instructional materials you're going to need to keep with you. So like in my teacher space, we always had a really nice desk that could either be a stand-up desk or a sit-down desk, and it was attached to our computer. And then we had a smart board. So I would have like my teacher model interactive notebook, that I would use on my document camera as my students followed along in their notebooks. I would have like my textbooks, my copies, anything I needed for like instruction. And then I would have my projector, and then I would have my anchor charts for like whatever current learning we were doing. And then I would move those anchor charts around my room as, we moved on to other units, other lessons. But just consider like, are you going to need like your read aloud books right up there with you? Are you going to need like your math manipulatives with you? Are you going to need to have science lab materials? It really depends on like what your content is. And then you may or may not get a small group table, a kidney table. You may not even want a kidney table. Like, they teach us in school, like, oh, you're going to have your small group table and your small groups are going to be like 2 to 5 kids. We all know that's not true. I've had years where I didn't have a kidney table and it actually worked out better because I would just pull all 10 kids in my small group and we would just sit on the floor together in our mini lesson area. And that actually worked really well. But like either way, no matter what physical table or space you have, it's nice to have like an area where you can keep like all of your materials that you'll need for your small groups, or whenever you have to pull a group to do a reteach, or you're doing like a push-in where you go and push into other table groups if that's your small group. I've had years where I've had like a cart with all of my things. I've had years where it's on a table. I've had years where it's on like a bookcase on the ground. But I always had like mini whiteboards. I always had tabletop anchor charts. I had my box of markers that I would use for my anchor charts. Sometimes it's nice to have like a whiteboard behind you where you can, write your math problems, or you can write your frequently misspelled words, or you could even have like a little learning target for your small group that you're doing. Maybe you need like extra pencils for your small groups. Maybe you need mini whiteboards and erasers. Maybe you need red pens. Maybe you need clipboards. You need a place for copies for your small groups. But it's nice to have like all of your stuff like in an area for your small groups. And then another key for setting up your classroom, especially in elementary, is do you need a space on your floor for mini lessons or carpet time or morning meeting? It'd be great if those areas could like overlap. You use your morning meeting place and it's the same place as like your mini lesson or your come to the carpet area. I remember whenever I moved from 4th grade where we had to do Lucy Calkins, and every reading lesson, every writing lesson was on the floor mini lesson, and then they would go back to their seats for readers workshop. I remember whenever I moved to 5th grade, I asked my instructional coach, like, do 5th graders still come to the floor? And she was like, girl, they're going to do whatever you want them to do. And I taught 5th grade math, and sure enough, I had my kids come sit on the floor just because I felt like I could like keep better control of my students, and I had like my finger on the pulse of like how we were doing. If their attention was with me, I could see everyone at the same time. So I honestly prefer, no matter the age, having my kids come to the floor for a mini lesson. So some things to think about is like you're gonna need more space than you think for the floor. Have your kids fill in a certain way. If you want to know like how I did all of that stuff, I have all of exactly how I broke down all of my routines in a like huge document that's on my website. I can link it for you guys, but it's like all my expectations for how my students came to the floor, what seating arrangements we did on the floor, how I taught that to them, all kinds of questions for like what you need to consider whenever you're designing those things and coming up with those routines. But whether you're doing morning meeting or you are doing a mini lesson on the floor, do not let your kids come and sit down on that floor. However, you have to have some type of like organization system for how your kids come to the floor. So if it's morning meeting, I always had a pink circle on the floor, and that's where Miss Phillips sat. And whenever I would call my students to come to the floor, they knew that they would fill in one by one. What is that? Counterclockwise next to my spot. So I would say like red table, you guys are ready for morning meeting, go have a seat. They would come to the floor. The first person to get there would sit counterclockwise to the right of my dot, and they would fill in one by one. If you let kids sit however they want to next to whoever they want to, that's not what they're like, that's not why they're supposed to be there. They're not there to like socialize with their friends. They're there to pay attention. So if they're sitting with their friend, what do you think their number one priority is going to be? It's going to be socializing with their friend. They're supposed to be there paying attention to you, especially if it's morning meeting. Like the whole point of morning meeting is to like build a community. So if you have kids sitting in little like insular pockets of like their besties, they're not going to be like participating in the whole point of morning meeting, which is like interacting with the class. So you want kids to sit next to different people every day, ideally in morning meeting. Same for those mini lessons. So I would have my students fill in, like it's usually rows of 5 or rows of 4. And so I would teach them the difference between rows and columns. So I would always have like rows of 5 students. I would have 4 rows of 5 students. And so I would say, you know, red table, come fill in on the floor. And they knew to start the first spot, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. If they're the 6th person, they start that new row. And sure enough, you have to watch, especially in the beginning, and redirect. Nope, there's only 4 people in the first row. You need to go back and try again. So-and-so, you need to move. And eventually it'll come together. And we will talk about how to teach all those routines later in the series. That's a whole nother game. And like how you teach those routines is like so important as to like the success of the routines. You could have the best routines in the world, the best structures and systems in the world, but if you don't teach it, if you don't enforce it like consistently every single time, it's all gonna fall apart anyways. And all your hard work will be gone. And same rules of thumb for like your morning meeting area and your mini lesson area. You need to have like, if there's certain materials that you always need for those chunks of instruction, have those materials like ready to go, because again, we're designing for efficiency. We want things to be like, your stuff is right where you need it. There's systems for how you pass it out. The kids know what they need. We also want to like foster independence with the students. So for example, when I taught math, if we needed like manipulatives, we were doing fractions for a lesson, I would make sure that I had like a little section at the front of my mini lesson area with all of our fraction pieces like ready to go. And my students know the first person will grab the bin, they would pass out for their row, pass the bin back, pass out manipulatives to their row, pass the bin back. Or if we needed red pens to like, you know, go over a quiz or something, they would grab the bucket of red pens, pass them out, pass the bucket behind them. So whatever materials you're going to need for like your instructional space, have them like as close to you as possible or as close to the students as possible, and have a system for like how you can roll that out, how the students use those materials. It's also nice for like if you have students sitting on the floor to have a space that's like nice and low for if you have any like instructional materials like anchor charts, especially at the beginning of the year for like reminders of how they're supposed to sit or like their expectations. Like a little chart I can of like how to show that you're ready or what our seating arrangement is on the floor, like kind of like at eye level. Same for morning meeting. Almost all year I had up like our agenda for our morning meeting. It would be like, you know, Ms. Phillips would take care of housekeeping or like any announcements. Then we would do our greeting. Then we would do our topic. You know, it was like a little agenda that I kept anchored for us, as well as our morning meeting expectations. And again, we're going to talk about all that stuff later on in this series. Or if you're like, I need it now, I have no idea, I want all the resources, I can link it in the description, and it is all on my website for you guys. Okay, so if those are like the bones of your classroom, you know, like your little instructional areas, your areas versus their areas, let's now talk about like your areas for your students, how you're going to set those up, what things you might need to like consider. We'll talk about how to use those things again later on in this series because there's so much to go over. But let's kind of get like the bones figured out. And remember that we're like designing for efficiency. So we want students to be like independent. We want to have systems for how students use these things. We want to let students eventually essentially like the goal is for your students to like run the classroom, no matter if they're kindergarten or if they're 8th grade. There are ways that you can get students to not need you and they can like run your classroom on your own. That's always a goal of mine, is like by October, I want my room to run itself. A big thing that helps with that is also student jobs, which we will also talk about later in this series. All of my students have jobs. They all run my classroom. It is amazing. Do not sleep on student jobs. And we're not just talking like vanity titles like line leader and things like that. Like they're sharpening our pencils for us. They're passing out homework for us. They're collecting homework for us. They're passing out notebooks. They're doing everything for us. Okay, so I digress. Back on track. So if we're talking about our areas for our students, some things to keep in mind is that ideally, if you can, we want to keep like those areas that students are going to use, you know, things like pencils, turn-in trays, like an area where they pick up their homework every day, whatever it is, you kind of want to keep all that together if you can, like in one consistent place. I've seen classroom teachers have like, you know, student station setups or like student office setups, or, you know, they have like a cute little bulletin board with, you know, all the things that they need right there. I highly recommend having table group supply caddies. And in those supply caddies, you have the stuff that your students are going to use every day. Yes, I know students are supposed to have pencil bags and all the things that they need, but in the real world, that's honestly not how it looks. So in my table caddies, I always had sharpened pencils, glue sticks, and scissors, because those are the things that we used almost every single day. It's going to be different for you if you use things like colored pencils every day, or things like markers or highlighters or red pens every day. Keep what you're going to need every day. And at the beginning of the year, we only had pencils. We're not using glue and scissors on the first day of school, so I'm not going to give those things to those kids yet. I'll roll those out and teach my students how to use those things when it's time. But you can start simple and just have out pencils on the first day of school. That's okay. Some other areas that you might need to consider that students might need. I always had like an organization system for extras and like extra copies. So say for example, student lost their Tuesday copy of their homework. They're not going to raise their hand and tell me that they lost their copy. They're not going to sit there on Friday and say, I know I lost my copy of my homework on Tuesday. They know that our expectation is that they go to our extras tab, they find the file with homework, and they flip through and they look for Tuesday's copy of the homework, and they help themselves to those extras. I always print out like 10 extra copies of everything. My class secretary passes out papers, and then they go put any extras in that extras tub. It is a lifesaver. I've used that since my first year, and I've tweaked it a little bit here and there, but it is a great system. And also it puts that independence back in students' hands. That's one less task for you to worry about when students lose papers. It's all right there. You do have to enforce them using that extras tub. The responsibility ultimately is on them. You guys also know that I love to teach like a champion strategies, and one of their strategies is do now. So whenever your students walk into your classroom, again, later we'll talk about like how to set up those systems and like what type of routine you want, but it's ideal that whenever students walk into your classroom, they have a task they can start right away independently that reviews something that you guys have already learned, and that's called a do now. So you could have like, you know, their warm up sitting on like a desk right whenever they walk in, and they know to grab their do now right off the desk, or maybe they grab their homework every day whenever they come in, or maybe they grab a copy of the notes every day off the desk. But like if you have a station where students pick up papers every day, put that in the same place. Things like earbuds checkout system or your headphones checkout system, or extra notebook paper, scrap paper, extra pencils. You can keep your pencil sharpener over there. You can keep your turn-in trays over there, devices, absence work. I also had a folder like stapled to my wall that was like absences, and I had this little absence sheet that is also on my website, and I would fill out a copy that said what we missed and what the students need to work on. My attendance clerk would staple the extra copies to it and put it with that student's name in the absence file, and students knew that whenever they were absent, they would come in, find their paper with their name on it, and take it to their seat, read over it, and it would tell them exactly what to do. It's a great system. Highly recommend. So again, key takeaway here is it's great to have all the stuff that your students are going to be accessing like on the regular. You'll need routines for it and like expectations for it, but to kind of all those things can be in like that student supplies area to kind of keep it all in one space for them. They know that like that's their area. Another key area to your classroom, no matter what your grade level or content area is like a calm down space. And I know even if you're like high school, you're like, I'm not doing a calm down corner. Like I get it. Even like a desk that's like a second chance area where students can go without consequence, where they need to just like get their lives together, I think is like a great like regulation strategy that even like adults need. You kind of just need to like step away sometimes to get your life together. Kids 100% need that too, with expectations. At my school, they gave us like these really nice flexible seating systems with like one of the seats that we got was like a booth, and all of us were like, what do we do with this? And it was our calm down corner. It was perfect. My students had a day where they all brought in stuffed animals. I brought in extra stuffed animals for my kids who wouldn't have any, and those wound up staying at my calm down corner. And the calm down corner for me just kind of like evolved over time. But long story short, you're going to need a space where kids can go without consequence to get their lives together, because sometimes that just needs to happen. Not everything needs a consequence. Like sometimes kids just need to get their lives together. So hence a calm down corner. It can literally, like I said, just be like a chair. You don't want to like facing the wall because that gives like punitive and like the dunce corner. But you want to keep it like away from the group. You want to keep it visible to where you can still see what's going on, but also kind of like provide some privacy if you can. If you choose to do like the desk or something, it's nice to have like another option could be like a bin of like one of those flat bins, full of like, fidgets or like emotional regulation menus or feelings charts or timers, like sensory bottles, things like that. So like a tub of tools is nice too. And then of course, an obvious one for like ELA teachers is like your books, like your reading corner. Even if you're not like a language arts teacher, I've always had bookcases in my room. Mostly because I used to teach language arts, but it kind of just like, I just think it's nice to have books in your classroom. Like sometimes you just need books in your classroom. Sometimes it's just like literally everyone be quiet, put your stuff away, and we're going to read for 20 minutes. Like we're readers. We just like to read. And like I taught science for a long time too. So I loved having like nonfiction books like that matched our units, or social studies that matched our units out on my bookcases. I just think it's like nice to like just foster a culture of like literacy. But like a lot of like how your books are going to be set up is going to be based on your curriculum, and like your instructional coaches can help you with that, or how your bins are organized, or how they're leveled, like how accessible they are. And those things can also be like tweaked throughout the school year. And then our last like subcategory for setting up your classroom is obviously the vibes. Like classrooms, for some reason, I don't know who decided in schools that they should have like sterile surgical fluorescent lighting, but like that's so overstimulating for our kids who already are overstimulated. So luckily at my campus, we had like a dim switch so I could always dim my lights. But either way, I think like ambient lighting is so nice. So even if you don't have like natural lighting, we never had natural lighting in our building. I always had tons of lamps. My last few years, I got like LED lighting that my students really liked. It's just nice to have like soft, dim, ambient sources of lighting in your classroom, because like the overstimulation in a school in general is like off the charts. So any way that you could like take the sensory stuff, the sensory input down a notch, I think is great. I also think it's really important in your classroom. Like, yes, you want it to like work for you, work for your kids. We want to choose like how it functions over like how it looks, like a classroom that like flows nicely versus like it being like Instagrammable. We want it to flow nicely. That's obviously the priority, but you also want it to like, it's going to be like your second home. It needs to like speak to you. So some things that I always had in my classroom that made it feel like home to me were the low lighting. I always had on like lo-fi study beats. And then I love plants. Those are some things that like I brought from home that made my classroom feel like me. But if you love like comfy textures, you can have like your soft cardigan on your chair, or like a cute comfy chair that you like to have in your classroom, like a blanket on the back of your chair. If you like fuzzy pillows, like just find something that makes it, that like speaks to you. And we all know that teachers love to have like a theme or something that fits them, like whether it's disco balls or sharks or whatever it is. Like I also think that is very like classroom friendly and makes your classroom feel like home too. And then new teachers, this is something that I learned over time. Like I hate to tell y'all this, but if you go to like buy a rug or flexible seating, if you go the cheap route, unfortunately those things are not made to outlast children. Like children tear stuff up. Like they don't even mean to. They're just like rough and they're big and whatever. Like your stuff will get torn up, especially if you go the cheap route. So put, an Amazon wish list link in your Instagram story, or do a donors choose, or reach out to organizations near you. Like you can try to get like a donation for like, the pricier things, but those pricey things will last. I found a really cheap rug on Amazon that actually lasted a long time. So there are like some exceptions, but just know if you go the cheap route, your stuff will get torn up usually. And then the last thing that I think provides really nice vibes, I think is also really slept on. If you've been following me for a while, you know that I love letting kids like add their touches to the classroom. I think is such a like underappreciated and under talked about like characteristic of classrooms. I follow this creator, I can't think of her name right now. She did an Instagram post one time about how she worked at a school where they couldn't put up store-bought anything, not border around their boards, not letters that came from Mardell, nothing. Everything had to be from the kids or from like their teachers' like workroom. So like for their border, they would take like scrunched up paper and use that as their border. All their letters came from like the die cut machine. And like, I know you're probably thinking like, what's the freaking point of that? Why? it like forced them to use the kids to help them decorate the classroom. Like she had like a colors wall, and it was like all the kids wore something red that day. And so they took a class picture and printed it out, and it was like red, and it had the kids all wearing red, orange, yellow. It was so cute. So what that means is that your classroom might look really bare at the beginning of the year. Like honestly, it should be really bare at the beginning of the year as far as like decor goes, because your students will fill it throughout the school year with like all the work that they do. Like I had one year where my students got really into like drawing, and so my whole door was like a whole collage. It was awesome. It was like a whole collage of all the artwork that they did throughout the year. And it just felt like it was our space together and just made like a really cozy, comfortable space for us. Okay, that covers like the foundations for like setting up your physical space. Overwhelming? Yes, I know it can be, but just remember that there's no like hack or quick fix or like silver bullet for like setting up your classroom perfectly, perfect classroom management systems. Like you just have to start with like a really strong, solid foundation. Because remember that like how your classroom flows and functions is ultimately what's going to make you feel really good. What's going to make you like want to come to work every day is how your classroom feels. Yes, if it looks cute, like that's obviously a bonus, but like we all know that we've had years where your room is like the cutest room ever, but you hated coming to work every day because your classroom management just like was garbage. So if you're like, yes, oh my God, like I love all these systems, I want more, I need it all, I have like 2 full breakdowns on my website of like exactly what I've done for every little thing in my classroom. There's also like a planning page that has questions to ask yourself so that you can come up with your own systems. But again, we will also talk about that later in this series, like routines for all these little things. I can link all those resources that are on my website in the description for you guys. So next we're going to get into all of those routines. So if you were like, hell yes, I'm so ready for this. This is exactly what I've been looking for. I just didn't know like where to get started. Like we don't know, right? That is what we're going to be talking about all summer. We are starting next with transitions in our classroom, instructional routines. So how to get your kids like tip top, answering your questions, participating, like just really good, solid kids are running your classroom type routines. We're going to go through all of it together this summer. So it's going to be very peaceful, very vibesy, very structured. So stay tuned, besties.